Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja played 122-move game in Speed Chess Championship finals, and in the end of this game they got super rare endgame. Watch till the end to find out how. Alireza started with e4, Magnus replied e5, knight on f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3. And now here is Italian game, 2 knights, modern bishops opening. Bishop e7, knight c3, castle, a3, d6, bishop f3. Now these moves are theoretical. Bishop e6, knight d5, bishop takes d5, e takes d5. After knight b8 seems like Magnus got better position, as look Alireza's pawn structure and this bishop on c4, and Magnus' idea is probably to play knight d7 in order to play knight b6 or knight c5 to attack pawn on d5 and a4. So the idea here probably was for Alireza to simply push this pawn and not let a6 and b5, but after c6 Magnus is already getting big advantage here, because Magnus will be able to trade these pawns and get these strong pawns in center. So here Alireza played bishop a2. That was all his point of playing a4, to have this bishop protected on a2. Knight b d7 and castle. And next move d5. Magnus is doing regular moves here, develops his pieces, tries to take whole center with his pawns. And next is c3. Now Alireza does not allow Magnus to play d4 next, and I think this was only his move. And then if he needs, he can play bishop b1 and play d4. a5. Magnus wants to probably play rook b8 in order to attack pawn on b2. And a5 is strong move. It also does not allow this pawn to go farther. And next move is queen c2. Well, Alireza has to do something. He has to develop his pieces. Otherwise, Magnus is attacking pretty fast here. Rook e8. It's necessary to include all of your pieces into the game in order to get big advantage and then eventually win. b4. Alireza is trying to play in queenside because the center is taken by Magnus. A takes b4, c takes b4, bishop takes b4, and queen c6. Now it's equal position with materials, but after queen on a5, Magnus just has whole space. These rooks are coming into game, so that's why Magnus has big advantage. Queen on a5 and bishop a3. Instead of bishop a3, it would be much better to play rook on ac1, as if Magnus would take on a4, here is bishop d5, and Alireza would get back the pawn. And if Black would not take on a4 and probably play like d4, for example, there's bishop g5, and Alireza is doing much better here than after bishop b3. Here Magnus made a mistake. Rook ac8 is mistaken. Now it equals position after queen b5. Instead of rook on ac8, would be much better to play knight c5, just bringing a knight into game. And if white would trade, now Magnus would take it, and then rook on fc8 is hanging. Well, even though Magnus has advantage here, it's pretty tough game, and it's not easy to win. Rook on ac8, which was mistaken, queen b5. It allows whites to start breathing already in this position and trade these queens. Queen takes b5, a takes b5, and rook b8. After rook b8, they just want to attack b5 pawn, which is totally like normal, and they didn't want to trade this rook with rook on a8, so that's why Magnus played rook b8. And rook on fc1 tries to get c file. Well, instead of rook on fc1, would be also interesting to play d4, just simply trade one of those centralized pawns, and he takes d4, and there's knight d4, it protects the b5 pawn also, maybe attacking knight on c6, so it would be also a good idea instead of rook on fc1. Rook on fc1 and rook takes b5. Alireza is giving pawn to Magnus in order to get this light squared bishop open and start attacking, which is a very common idea, to give away pawn in order to let your pieces become active. Bishop on a4 and rook on a5. Now, idea is to take on d7, take, and just simply play d4. Well, here Alireza would lose pawn, but he would have bigger chances to make a draw because there's still so many pieces in order to make a draw. Bishop c6 and rook c8. Well, Magnus avoids to trade the rook, rook b1 and bishop f8. g4. Alireza is going something crazy. He wants to start attacking in order to get some counterplay. d4, strong move, pushing pawn to center. Bishop d2 and rook c5. Yes, Magnus wants to trade these rooks. Bishop e5 and take with bishop. Would be interesting to take with rook, which would be the best move here actually, because Magnus can't take on g4 because this knight is hanging. So that's why it would be much better to take with rook. And after rook takes c1, like rook c5 would be only move, and just simply trade and play knight on e5. Now this pawn is protected, and plus bishop c4, f7 would be hanging also. And here Alireza would feel absolutely great coming out from the position which was totally worse. But he took with bishop on c1. And rook b8. Now already Magnus is increasing his advantage. As you can see, this bishop is pinned, so this bishop can't move easily. This pawn is hanging at g4, so Alireza is in big trouble. Knight d2, protecting b1 rook in order to move the bishop. Magnus can't take on g4 because bishop d7 is hanging. Knight c5, bringing another piece to the game, and g5, because g4 was hanging and now Alireza has to push. Knight d5, bishop c4, rook takes b1, knight takes b1, and knight b4. Now d3 pawn is hanging. Knight d2, knight bd3, and bishop on a3. Now Alireza is totally losing because he's down 2 pawns and Magnus can just simply continue playing. But there is long way to go. Knight on f4, knight on f3, and knight d7. Instead of knight d7, would be just better to play knight cd3 in order to protect this pawn and eventually push it. Knight d7, bishop c1, and knight on e6. It was big time trouble, so that explains why they make these mistakes, which is totally understandable when you play really fast chess. Bishop b5 and knight c5. Magnus is trying probably to get more time and in order to win easily. King g2 and bishop d6. Would be much better to play f6 here, because to trade this pawn and then create this 3 pawns chain. Bishop d6 and bishop c4. Knight b6 would be great here because it would push this bishop out of this square, and then eventually d3. King on f8. Another good move in order to develop king, because in endgame, as you know, you need to use your king and you need to start developing with your king. h4, king e7, and h5. And f6. f6 is mistake because knight on h4 is hanging. Instead of f6, would be much better to play knight on e6 in order to attack pawn on g5 and then push pawn on e4 and etc. But there was f6, which was mistake, knight on h4. It gave Alireza a chance to play well and not lose the game. King d8 and knight on f5. Strong move. Attacking pawn, and all the moves to play bishop f8, and now black's bishop becomes really passive. Bishop f8, g6, h takes g6, h takes g6, and e4. e4 is mistake because it blunders pawn on d4. Instead of e4, would be much better to play knight on e4 and then probably idea of knight d6 and trade this strong knight on f5. e4, knight takes d4, and now there's got big chances to make a draw. Knight on e5, bishop d5, knight takes g6, and king on f1. In order to play king e2, king e3, and probably take this pawn on e4. Knight on e5, bishop a3, king d7, bishop e4, knight takes e4, bishop f8. Now seems really drawish, even though Magnus has extra pawn, but as we know, Magnus fights till the end in any endgames, even if it was 0.00. So g6, king e2, knight d6, and king on e3, and knight c6. And then there is knight e2. They're just simply moving these pieces around because they just simply want to win a time. Because if one of those would get flagged, they would lose. Either Alireza or Magnus. So they just simply move these pieces. King on e6, knight on f4, king on f7, bishop on a3, knight on e5, king e2, g5, knight e5. Neither of these sides are agreeing for the draw. Especially Magnus, as he is higher rated than firouzja. Not a very big difference, but still. They are this kind of players who wants to fight till the end, and that's why they are top grandmasters and we are not. Knight d4, king on f1, f5, bishop c5, knight f3, knight d2. Everyone would agree for the draw here. Literally everyone, most likely. But here they are fighting, and now we're going into a really important moment. King c2. It's mistake, because here after g4, Magnus is winning. because this pawn will become passed pawn, and for example bishop d8, knight on f2 is hanging, and if bishop c7, there is knight on e5, and it stops this bishop from taking on f4, and already Magnus would have 2 extra passed pawns. But he made a mistake and he played knight on e5, probably wanted to flag Alireza and win on time. And again, Alireza made another big mistake, bishop g5. After f3 would be better for Magnus, but after knight d4, king g5, it's pretty hard to win this. And Magnus took with knight on g5, knight on f4, and king on f4. Here we go. We arrived in one of the rarest chess endgames. Magnus has 2 knights, and Firouzja has pawn. Usually there should be this kind of situation, like when it will be close to stalemate, then there will be move for white to play with pawn, and then black would checkmate. But here it's not possible because they play really well. f3, strong move. If they take, it's a draw. So Magnus has to play knight on e6, king c3, knight g7, king d4, knight f5, king d5, knight on d3, king c4, king e3, king d5, knight on f4, just repeating moves, king e5, knight d4. And also it's important to remember 50 moves rule. And if there is already 50 moves done, it will be a draw without moving pawn. King d6, knight e2, king e5, king d3, king d6, king d4, king c6, king e5, king c5, knight d4, king c4. They're just simply moving this knight. And here, after king c4, already Magnus has a chance to win. King d2, king d4, and Magnus is winning after knight c5, king d2, knight b3, king c2, king c4, king d1, getting close to checkmate. King d3, king e1, knight d4, king f2, knight f5, king e1, king c2, king f1, king d2, getting close, very close for a win. King on f2, king d1, king on f1, and here, instead of king c2, it would be much better to play knight d3 in order to cut this king from f2 and force him to play king g2 and then king on e2, and making king closer to corner. King c2, king e1, king d3, and king d1. Of course, they have really short time, and calculating here is almost impossible, so that's why it's very hard to win this kind of game with like knight e3, king e1, knight c2. And now Magnus made a mistake. It would be much better to play king c2, king on f2, and knight on f5. But well, now as we have enough time, we can analyze it and check how black should have won. But when you have 5 seconds, it's really easy to make knight c2 mistake. And after knight c2, it's mistake because there's king on f2, and it kind of turns as a draw. King d2, king g3, king e3, king g4, knight d4, king g5, knight e6, king on f5, and king d4. Now it's already draw because white's king is just simply running away. King on f6, king d5, king on f5, king d5, king on f5, king d6, king on e4, king e7, king f5, king d6, king e4, king c6, king on e5. They're just simply moving these kings. There is no chance for Magnus to win. King on f6, knight d4, king g5, king e5, and they're just simply moving these pieces, and there's no chance. And soon chess.com show that it's a draw. And like and subscribe.